The fifth lesson of the third topic looks at what happened in the Sudetenland, that is the German-speaking area of Czechoslovakia created via the Treaty of Versailles, and appeasement. This is a linchpin lesson, one of the most important in the entire topic. So do pay close attention and consider the ramifications on this, on the overall subject matter, which is why did peace collapse up until 1939. Now, what is the Sudetenland? It's this little area here indicated in red, or pink, actually, more correctly. It digs well into Germany. In fact, it was one time part of Germany, but the Treaty of Versailles takes away, actually more correctly, the Treaty of Saint-Germain as part of the Versailles settlement takes away this area of Germany and gives it to the newly formed country of Czechoslovakia. Hitler hated this for three reasons. Number one, it's part of the overall Versailles settlements. Number two, Czechoslovakia had an alliance with Soviet Russia and France, part of the Treaty of Mutual Assistance, and it had a democratically elected government, which is something he despised. Not only that, Sudeten Germans living in that region, numbering about 3.5 million, complained of discrimination by the Czech-dominated government. And Hitler's great overall idea, that the concept of creating a Gross Deutschland, or unifying all Germans or bringing all Germans into the German Reich, was compromised by the very existence of the Sudetenland. Now, fear of Anschluss. Now, Czechoslovakia was led by a man named Edvard Benes. And Benes realized that Czechoslovakia would be next on Hitler's list after the unification of Germany and Austria in the process known as Anschluss. Benes goes on basically an international mission after Anschluss to seek reassurances from France and Britain and that they would support Czechoslovakia. France, of course, bound by its Treaty of Mutual Assistance with Czechoslovakia, said yes, of course it would support Czechoslovakia if it were threatened by Germany, and Britain felt bound to support the French. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, in this context, approaches Hitler and he asks if he had any designs on Czechoslovakia, and Hitler says no. Now, that changes relatively quickly in the summer of 1938. Hitler, of course, did have designs on Czechoslovakia. Hitler is not a man of his word, and he's prone to saying one thing and then changing his opinion shortly thereafter. Hitler will, through subterfuge, encourage protests and demonstrations in the Sudetenland by Sudeten Germans against the occupation, as they called it, of Czechoslovakia. As early as May 1938, Hitler, of course, had thought about taking the Sudetenland, but he was dissuaded by the prospect of war with Czechoslovakia, something he didn't necessarily want. It's really important to remember that the Czechoslovakian country itself is actually quite a powerful nation. They have, number one, quite a strong military. Number two, they have lots of natural resources, which makes them relatively wealthy. And number three, they have one of the biggest armament factories in all of Europe. This is the Skoda armaments factory located outside of Prague. And this factory alone would be a tremendous bonus to Germany, but it is enough to dissuade an unprepared power from, let's say, taking on Czechoslovakia. You know you're going to get a well-armed and determined enemy in that case. However, as the summer of 1938 it goes on and tensions increase throughout Europe, people basically start to expect that it would lead to heavy bombing of cities like it had happened in Spain. Of course, the memory of Guernica, which we talked about last lesson, was still fresh in people's minds. So they begin to dig air raid shelters. In fact, this is happening in London at this particular point. Magazines carry ads for gas masks, as it seems that Neville Chamberlain is assuming that Germany will move into the Sudetenland and a war is increasingly likely. The first meeting on which a lot of this is based takes place at Berchtesgaden in Bavaria in 15th of September 1938. It's really the first summit meeting to talk about the issue of the Sudetenland. The British realizing that if they don't get involved and try and prevent this, Germany is going to end up taking it. It appears to go well. Hitler seems to moderate his demands. He says he only wants part of the Sudetenland, and only if a plebiscite is held that shows that the Sudeten Germans actually wanted to join Germany. Of course, this plebiscite and the eventual takeover, if in the event of this plebiscite, Hitler says, don't worry, the British, the French, and the Czech governments will have the final say, as if it's up to them. Now, after this meeting, of course, Chamberlain thinks that maybe potentially war is preventable. But only a week later, it's on the 22nd of September, at another meeting in Bad Godesberg, which is in the Rhineland, the French and British governments put their plans, if you will, to give Hitler parts of the Sudetenland, as discussed a week earlier, to the Czechs. But 3 days after this, on the 22nd of September, Hitler will increase his demands. He says he regretted that previously agreed to terms were not enough. He wants, in fact, all of the Sudetenland. For Chamberlain, this is completely unacceptable, and he demands that the Czechs, Hitler's demands, that is, that the Czechs would withdraw from the Sudetenland by October 1st, meant in the eyes of Chamberlain that Germany and France and Britain would be at war with each other by the 1st of October 1938. In fact, Chamberlain returns home and he encourages the building of air raid shelters, etc., etc., etc. Just at that moment, when all seems lost, enters, actually, and very ironically, a third party, Benito Mussolini. Now, in the intervening time, of course, let me just step back for a second. Chamberlain, of course, appalled by Hitler's change of direction, goes back and prepares for war. The French will mobilize their army. The British Navy will become mobilized. What mobilization means is the men are called to their barracks. They are equipped. In the case of the Navy, all of the Navy ships are loaded up with food and weapons in preparation for setting sail and heading to war. And when Hitler realized that the British and the French seemed serious and that he was on the brink of a European war, he wasn't quite ready for it this particular time. He agreed to a suggestion supported by and proposed in many ways by Mussolini of an international conference to settle this dispute. And this international conference will become the very, very famous Munich Conference. The Munich Conference is known for appeasement. Appeasement, of course, we've repeated this now, means giving in to Hitler in order to ensure that war is avoided. Now, the participants in the Munich Conference are fourfold. Okay, the first, of course, is Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain; Adolf Hitler, the Führer, leader of Germany; Benito Mussolini, the Duce, the leader of Italy; Edouard Daladier, the French president. Now, what did they decide at the Munich Conference? Number one, they decide to give in to Hitler's demands over a 10-day period to have all of the Sudetenland. Okay, they would follow this with plebiscites that would confirm whether or not these areas wish to remain part of Germany, but also in other areas of Czechoslovakia, where there were, for instance, Hungarian speakers and Polish speakers. Plebiscites would be held in those areas to figure out what the people in those regions wanted to be. The four powers would guarantee the remainder of Czechoslovakia's security, i.e., if Hitler had designs on it or went for it, they would guarantee it by declaring war on Germany, once, of course, the small Polish and Hungarian claims had been met. The Munich Agreement is what is the result of all of this, and this is famous, one of the most famous pictures of all time, in that's Neville Chamberlain holding up a signed document from Hitler. One of the things that's important to note about the Munich Agreement is they did not consult the Czechoslovakians. Edward Bennis resigns in frustration, in fact. And they did not consult the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union feels that the British and the French are going against them at this point and are not including them. And Stalin becomes very keen to avoid war because he doesn't believe he can trust the British and the French. And in fact, what he does is he signs, and we'll learn about this next lesson, an alliance with Hitler, ironically. It's important to remember that Hitler doesn't invade the Soviet Union until 1941. Up until that point, they were in a sort of a peaceful alliance, a pact which agreed that neither country would invade the other. Anyways, what does all this mean? The Munich Agreement means that the Czechs basically have to suck it up. Their country is going to be broken up. The Germans are going to take the Sudetenland. A small part is going to be taken by Hungary, and another small part taken by Poland. And Chamberlain gets to, I guess, play himself off as the hero. Okay, Hitler signs a document which Chamberlain famously brings back to London, and when he lands, holds it up aloft for the world's press and says that, you know, we will use consultation, that Britain and Germany will never go to war again. And Chamberlain famously claims that this document ensures that there will be peace in our time. The consequences of this document and this appeasement are great and many. Of course, Hitler gambled once again that the British and the French would do nothing, and he did. He was successful. He said basically of the Munich Agreement, it was an undreamt of triumph, so great you can scarcely imagine it. Hungary and Poland also get a little bit of the Czechoslovakian territory, and overall you have the Czechs are betrayed. Edvard Bennis, the president of Czechoslovakia, resigns. Europe, generally speaking, is actually really pleased with the Munich Agreement. And we look upon it now from our 20th century lens with derision. We hate it. We think it's a terrible thing because, of course, it let Hitler think he could get away with murder, and he continues to demand more. But in reality, at the time, Europe was relieved it avoided war. In fact, when Mussolini returns back to Italy, Italy is a country that will join Germany in a short period of time in World War II. The people are like, they cheer him as a conquering hero because he had become, an important figure in maintaining peace in the world. And Chamberlain in Britain, for a very short period of time, was proclaimed as a hero, someone who prevented another massive war, because, of course, the memories of the First World War are fresh in all Europeans at all Europeans' minds at this time, and it's difficult. It becomes difficult for us to judge just how profound that was. If you can imagine, in your lifetime, the horrors of the First World War are sort of front and center, that you sort of start to get why they did this, even though, of course, the Czechoslovakians were sacrificed in a big way. So, was it a good and a bad decision? I'm going to let you sort of read through this, but there are certainly reasons for and against. The big ones are this. Number one, it buys time. Britain can prepare to fight a war. It can continue rearmament. Um, it means that war is at least avoided and the potential of war is avoided. I'll let you get into the finer points in your own. On the other hand, of course, more than anything, it's a supreme example of appeasement. Basically, it meant that Hitler felt that he could get more and more and more. Not only that, do they abandon a country like Czechoslovakia that not only did the British and French create, that they, in the French case anyway, just a year or two before in the Treaty of Mutual Assistance, had agreed to protect. Anyhow, make a long story short, one of the other important things is the fact that Britain and France had, if a war had broken out in 1938, had a good chance of getting the Soviet Union on side. But because they had ignored the Soviets in the making of the Munich Agreement or the drafting of the Munich Agreement, there's no way in 1939 or 1938, for that matter, the Soviets are going to fight with the British and the French. And it's going to take quite a bit for that to happen. So, in a sense, the Munich Agreement does avoid war, and it does, I suppose, appease the people. But on the other hand, it does create a whole bunch of problems later down the road, which of course Hitler is willing to and means to very much exploit. The end of appeasement comes in March 1939. By 1939, they switch their policy of appeasement to what becomes known as deterrence. Czechoslovakia, after the Munich Agreement, is not settled. You have a massively problematic country, a country with Czechs, Magyars, Slavs, Ruthenians. Once the Sudetenland is transferred, the rest of the country starts to break up, and Czechoslovakia basically dissolves into civil war. Nevertheless, in this context of chaos, it's still a country that's very attractive to a country like Germany. It's full of rich agriculture. It's full of industry, armaments, as I said earlier. And these are resources Hitler wants. And of course, after he gets what he wants in the Munich Agreement, he will continue and invade Czechoslovakia. Now, in March of 1939, President Haka, who replaced Bennett's, is bullied into placing his countries in the hands of the German Reich. The German army will walk into Czechoslovakia unopposed. Czechoslovakia knew it could have fought, but knew it would have lost. And as a result, they effectively turn over Czechoslovakia in March 1939. The events of this invasion are incredibly complicated, but it's also important to understand what it reveals about Hitler's true intentions. Before the full invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it was easy for everybody to conclude that all Hitler wanted to do was unify all German-speaking people. And to a lot of people, particularly in Britain, but also in France and the rest of the world, a lot of people said, well, that's justified. They're Germans. They should be in Germany. However, when he invades the rest of Czechoslovakia and he takes over Czechs, Magyars, a whole bunch of other ethnic groups, it becomes clear because it reveals Hitler's intentions are broader than just uniting all Germans. He's now taking over territory to increase German power. Germany has no more right to Czechoslovakia than it did anywhere else in Europe. Okay, it was now straying beyond what was considered acceptable, that is, building or uniting all Germans in a greater Germany. He's now very evidently making a bid to dominate Europe by force. Unless deterred, Poland would obviously be his next step. Of course, all of this is outlined in his book, Mein Kampf. What we'll see in the next and final lesson is exactly where Britain and France draw the line. They're willing to accept the sort of invasion, even though there's no fighting of Czechoslovakia and the loss of Czechoslovakia. They write it off as a loss, but Poland would be too far. But how would Hitler ensure that he did not end up in a war against Britain and France in the West and the Soviet Union in the East? That is the key question. And when he resolves that question, then of course he's free to take Poland and begin World War II. But that's the subject for next lesson.